for many Iranians, an apology from their government is simply not enough. Social media footage shows security forces firing tear gas at crowds trying to reach Tehran's main square. Protesters are angry at what they say is leaders' attempts to cover up the truth behind the downing of Ukraine International Airlines flight PS752.
We've seen 7 people shot so far. It's all blood.
In Canada, more emotional outpourings. This time mourning the dozens of Canadian citizens who died in the crash.
My family is devastated. They've lost the most supporting person they've ever had. I lost my second dad. And the family, the wife and the 2 kids, honestly, I can't imagine how they're going to go through this.
At one of the vigils, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised to pursue justice.
176 lives were extinguished in the space of a few minutes last Wednesday morning, but you are not alone. Your entire country stands with you tonight, tomorrow, and in all the years to come. We will build that future they all dreamed of together.
On Saturday, Iran admitted its military had accidentally shot down the aircraft, which it had mistaken for a hostile target. The country had been on high alert after carrying out missile strikes on US targets in Iraq. The attacks were in retaliation for the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in a US drone attack. Iran initially said the crash was caused by technical failure, but officials deny they misled the public.
Some criticize us for not providing information sooner. The truth is, we were gathering information from all relevant officials to identify the cause of the incident.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has demanded an open investigation, compensation for the victims' families, and a formal apology. The plane's black boxes have been recovered. Iran is allowing Ukrainian, Canadian, and American investigators to help with the probe, but it says it could take 1 or 2 years to complete. Nicholas Morgan, TRT World.
Well, the protests are the latest sign in a series of demonstrations against the government, which is also under pressure over the country's dire economic conditions. International sanctions have quashed Iran's major exports like oil and metals, and the private sector has been suffocated by the rising share of public sector companies in domestic businesses. The World Bank says the economy shrank by nearly 9% in 2019 and that growth will remain under 1% until at least 2022. Last week, the US slapped more sanctions on Tehran's few remaining export industries, and youth unemployment has already risen to nearly 30% and could worsen on the back of those fresh sanctions. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Sina Toossi in Washington. He's a senior research analyst at the National Iranian American Council. Welcome back to the program, Sina. Can we start with these protests now? They've been going on for 3 days now, ostensibly because of Iran's admission that it shot down the Ukrainian jetliner, killing 176 people. But is that what these protests are about solely?
Yeah, so the trigger was the shooting down of this plane crash, and the Iranian government essentially covering up the fact that they shot it down for 3 days, which really caused a lot of outrage by the Iranian public. But these protests really reflect the deep-seated grievances that many Iranians have at the political and economic status quo in the country, and we've seen protests like this every couple months, every couple years in Iran. Most recently, last November, after there was this surprise increase in the price of gas, and many Iranians want deep-seated change in their country.
Now, tell us about those grievances. What exactly are the protesters demanding, and what's triggered these almost continual demonstrations on the streets of Iran?
So I think the economic situation, largely because of the Trump administration sanctions, has really been devastating for Iran. We've seen the middle class has been impoverished. As your report just said, inflation has gone up. Kind of the value of the currency has kind of devalued. But I think this context of the maximum pressure campaign is a really important part of this story. We've seen the Trump administration left the Iran nuclear deal, and in substitute, it's been pursuing these very severe economic sanctions that, above all, it's ordinary Iranian people who are paying the price. And we've seen that with these kind of sanctions regimes, in practically every case, it's not the kind of the regimes or the ruling elites of these countries that pay the price. It's the ordinary population. And if anything, the regimes become more entrenched, as we've seen in Cuba, 60 years after the embargo, like we're seeing in Venezuela today. And right now, this scenario is playing out in Iran, where the population is getting more desperate. The middle class, which is the vessel for democratic change, is getting impoverished. And meanwhile, the ruling elite and the kind of the overall political system is getting more entrenched as well.
Now, the Iranian leadership has been keen to portray this as the US punishing Iran and its ordinary citizens. After all, these are US sanctions that are hurting the Iranian economy. Is that something that the people themselves believe, or are they squarely putting the blame on the leadership?
I think, Iran is not a monolithic society by any stretch. And we saw last week with the U.S. assassination of General Qasem Soleimani that, millions of people across the country came out in these kind of unprecedented mourning ceremonies across the country for Soleimani, who was ultimately a Revolutionary Guards commander who did really exemplify Iran's regional policies and all these kind of policies that the Trump administration is trying to push back. And, this weekend, we're seeing many Iranians in these videos coming out and protesting for political reasons over the plane shoot down. And I think it's important to note these aren't mutually exclusive. I don't think, we try to paint the Iranian people in these very black and white terms, like they support U.S. objectives or they don't. But in reality, many Iranians, they want to protect their country, or they might support this general like Soleimani. At the same time, they're outraged over the incompetency of the government in other areas. So these are not mutually exclusive.
Now, we know the 2015 nuclear deal is pretty much hanging on by a thread after the US withdrew from the deal that was signed with Iran and the world's other major powers. The US says that it's imposing these sanctions to get Iran back to the negotiating table for a new nuclear deal. Is that something that Tehran and the Iranian leadership might entertain?
So this is a failed policy, maximum pressure. The U.S. says it seeks negotiations, but in reality, the options that have been presented to Iran is total surrender on its core national security interests, these 12 the maximalist demands given by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, or the total collapse of the country, state collapse. And we've seen in response to this, Iran has been raising the cost for U.S. pressure. These different actions in the region, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq. And I think, Trump, unfortunately, he's doubled down on this failed strategy last week by announcing new sanctions. And if Trump really wants to avert a war, he needs to be ready to offer some sanctions relief to Iran to kind of jumpstart negotiations and kind of rebuild confidence. But if just continuing down the maximum pressure, it makes a direct U.S.-Iran conflict inevitable.
Okay, now the official US line is that they're not seeking regime change in Iran, but obviously we're seeing signs of people on the streets now calling for the ouster of the current government and even the Ayatollah. Do you believe that the US is actually looking for regime change in Iran?
I think, first of all, I don't think there's a broad-based kind of revolutionary movement in Iran. I think the logical conclusion of Trump's policies is really state collapse and chaos and a destructive situation in Iran. It's eliminating the potential for peaceful democratic change. And Trump's Iran policy has really been driven by these vehement anti-Iran hardliners, people like U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and before him, National Security Advisor John Bolton. And these figures, their track records are of opposing diplomacy with Iran in principle and supporting war and kind of policies of regime change. And that's what's been enacted. And I think Trump, if he's sincere that he wants negotiations, he's been misled by his advisors on what maximum pressure is going to get him. Maximum pressure is going to get him war and not negotiations or a new deal.
Okay, Sina Toossi, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much, as always, for your analysis.